So welcome to everybody to our virtual artist talk with Johnny Plastini. He will be giving a presentation of his work that you can see virtually on our website at vcsu.com on the McCarthy Gallery page. Please check it out. And Johnny, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you. I'll share my screen now. Let's see. No.
Let me here, let me try. Does it work? No, it's okay.
Is my screen being shared right now? Yes? All right, cool. Don't make fun of my cluttered desktop. This is just what happens. I'm going to switch into presentation mode here. Let's see. All right, can everyone see my title page? It should say my name and then my rank. So once again, I'm Johnny Plastini, Associate Professor and Area Coordinator of Printmaking at Colorado State University. The way that I've structured this talk is I'll start off with a brief overview of my studio practice, encompassing about the past 10 years. And then I'll specifically address two bodies of work that are in the show that's currently up at the McCarthy Gallery at Valley City State. At this point, if the slides are progressing properly, you should see a redwood forest in front of you. Is that what everyone sees as a forest? Nod your head, yes, you see a forest. Okay, great, yeah. So I grew up on the rugged coastline of Northern California. That's also where I went to undergraduate school. I got a BA in painting from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And the University of California, Santa Cruz is nestled in the redwood forests right along the coast of California. So this is the landscape that is, common in that area. And the rich, lush forests and textures of the bark and the fog were very influential to my painting practice at the time. So I started out as a more traditional landscape painter and then started to branch off into more conceptual considerations of landscape. So in 2009, among other things, there was this awful apple moth epidemic. So in California, there are these worms that would like dangle from the trees. There are these little inchworms, and they had their silk strands. And walking to class or walking to the print studio, you kind of have to like avoid them. And I started making a series of these like foggy worm paintings that were inspired by the landscape, not necessarily from observation, but from this experience of walking through these kind of strands of worms. And they ended up increasing in scale to almost a one-to-one relationship to the body. So, they're about 6 feet tall. And I was working on these large panels. I was covering the panels with kind of like a grout or a mortar. So they had like a cave-like, rock-like quality. So very organic brushstrokes, oil painting on these mortar panels. And they were heavily influenced by an artist, Terry Winters. So the idea is that there's a biomorphic abstraction that's taking place away from traditional landscape painting towards thinking about architectures of the natural world. So that's a common thread that runs throughout my practice, is thinking philosophically about what an architecture is, not necessarily the walls that surround us, but what is the architecture of thought? What is the architecture of society? What are the architectures or building blocks of life in the natural world? So Terry Winters was a heavy influence as I was leaving undergraduate school and building a portfolio towards grad school. This also, this book, Karen Barad, Meeting the Universe Halfway, she started out as a quantum physicist and then turned philosopher and wrote this book. It's about the entanglement of matter and meaning. So thinking about how different, she calls them agents of the universe. So, matter from a micro perspective of atoms, but then also a macro perspective of the celestial bodies. How are those things linked, and how are all those aspects of our existence entangled, and how do we generate meaning from the natural world? This was the first print in a series of 10 that was the portfolio that I applied to grad school with. And synthesizing these ideas of, biomorphic abstraction, and then also thoughts about the micro and the macro perspective, things that are outside of our clear line of sight. And at this time also, there was a personal narrative that started to take hold within the work, and that my grandfather was declining through a dementia process, and my consciousness was growing as a young man. So I felt very much like this was a passing of the torch of sorts. And there was this metaphorical connection in that way, but also, in his eventual passing, I inherited his dentistry tools. He was a dentist and worked for many years as a dentist. So that really started to shape my aesthetic and process. So all those kind of lines you see there are swooping and cleaving marks from the dentistry tools on the lithographic stone that then gets printed onto the paper. And I'm thinking once again about things like quantum entanglement and atoms and the celestial bodies linked in the same space. I'm also somewhat of a sci-fi nerd. So there are some just speculative ideas. A tachyon is a theoretical particle that is governed by time. So if you were thinking about a particle that potentially could time travel, both in the past and the future. The Moirai, tying it to Greek mythology. So thinking about the goddesses, which are the weavers, the three weavers, the Moirai. There's one for the past, one for the present, and one for the future. So these goddesses theoretically are weaving the past, the present, and the future in the same space. And one of those goddesses may come and present themselves to you at some time or another, whether, thinking about aspects of regret in the past, a very present in the moment event, or thinking about the future. So, these went on and were a very fairly consistent body of work that ended up yielding a successful grad application to the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. So I started there in 2010. This was the last piece that I made prior to leaving Santa Cruz and moving to Philadelphia. And thinking about the idea of an oubliette. So if you're not familiar with what that is, it's this specific type of prison. So it's a prison without bars. It's a French prison where there's like a spire, and the person is left on the spire. So there are no bars, but it's like this open air prison where you only have a small area to stand, and you'll kind of fall to your death. So it's this paradox of you're imprisoned, but at the same time, there are no bars. So thinking about that physically, but then also psychologically, are there prisons perhaps of the mind that, you can get caught in a loop, but you actually are a free person? So when I arrived at grad school, I began to think a bit less about printmaking in the context of multiplicity or reproducing an image and creating a consistent edition of a particular drawing or painting on a stone or plate. And I started to think about the history of printmaking in relation to hacking technology. So, the origins of, let's say, Gutenberg's printing press. That actually was a wine press that was hacked to make prints. So that's something that is intrinsic to printmaking in general. So if you think of lithography as a medium that derived in order to print bank documents or whiskey labels or wallpaper, but now has been hacked and recontextualized mostly for fine art purposes. there are some applications still for fraud protection and otherwise where lithography is used in an industrial setting, but primarily now it's been hacked for fine art purposes. And John Cage, thinking about the unpredictability of an indirect medium and the printmaking process and hacking into the technology for fine art purposes. I started working with found materials and salvaged wood and making these like Petri dish hole saw plates. And I made a bunch of these. I was thinking about if you were to, take something like a melanoma cancer cell and turn something really ugly into something beautiful, how could you go about doing that? And I made a series of these Petri dish pieces, which were kind of marginally interesting, but I got bored of them pretty quick. In my frustration, I was gonna throw out these discarded pieces of the boards that I had drilled holes in to extract these kind of Petri dish forms. But I started breaking them up and preparing them for the trash. And I was like, wow, these actually are far more interesting than the thing that I originally thought I wanted to print from, which were the little discs. So I started running these big sheets of the wood through the press, the kind of remnants or the trash, the discarded aspect of the plate that I had not intended to be the work. But I ran with this idea and continued to make marks on them with the dentistry tools and this opposition of the hand present in the work, but then also this very mechanical relationship of the whole and thinking about the hand in printmaking versus the mechanized aspect of printmaking. And I made an entire series of these. They're fairly large, like 42-inch by 60-inch prints. It just goes to show you, something that you think of consciously may not actually be the best thing for the work. There are a lot of things in our periphery or the unconscious that can feed into the work if we're receptive to them. And so I made a lot of these, but then, they started to get kind of stale. It's like, am I going to be the whole components cookie cutter guy forever? And, I started to venture out a little bit and thinking a lot about, the loss of control or, instability. And, I was working with these saws in addition to the dentistry tools. And okay, well, what happens if I have the mechanical saw and then it kind of skids out of control, and it leaves its own mark. So the saw and the machine is able to speak in conjunction with my own subjectivity. And that's what I really derived and distilled out of this project and series of works was, okay, how can I unite my own voice with other agents, whether it's mechanical or biological? And that was a really big breaking point in the work. And at this time, I also started making my own ink and crafting my own ink from raw pigment and mixing things in my ink. This piece is not something that I made. It's a crystal ball from 2000 BC, but it is a really potent metaphor, and it's one of my favorite art objects. It's at the University of Pennsylvania Archaeology Museum. It's one of the world's largest crystal balls. And the thing that's interesting about this ball in particular is it was made over multiple generations. And there's a very lengthy process that it takes to make a crystal ball like this. It's about this big, the crystal ball. And it involves using bamboo shafts and sand to kind of round out the ball. It's like a rocking process for many years. And this ball is so perfect. It's more of a sphere than what we can produce with a laser cut. And the only way to make a ball like this is through years of using sand and garnet powder to polish out the ball. So I have a deep interest and reverence for craft. And this is a potent metaphor for me in thinking about how, something poetic and taking such a long time, despite it being seemingly tedious, can have an element of beauty beyond what is instant gratification easily achievable with, like a laser or a computer milling machine. So this for me is a relationship of pressure and time and, thinking about how all that can relate to printmaking and dissolving the hierarchy between craft, design, high art, lowbrow, all that kind of stuff. This body of work came about after the whole pieces, and that was directly in response to thinking about striations or core samples and working with encaustic medium, which is a combination of beeswax and damar resin on these deep wooden embossments. So I was taking found pieces of wood and making marks in them and scoring them in such a way that they're reminiscent of, striations of core samples. I was looking at these core sample images and relating geology and pressure and time to the printmaking process, but also, working with this ancient medium of encaustic and thinking about geologic time as opposed to like our human experience of time. I also, like I said, was making my own ink at the time. So, thinking about where does our ink come from, the materials that derive our inks, and where the best place would be to display these works. So I got permission myself and a couple other grads to have a show in the basement of this power plant in Philadelphia. And these works were printed with carbon black. So thinking about, potential ramifications of these old technologies of coal-fired power plants and things like that in relation to our potential future or lack thereof. So displaying this kind of striated work with the handmade ink in the basement of the power plant made me consider alternative gallery spaces apart from the typical white cube and how that also can inform the work and create meaning in the work. And once again, continuing the thread, thinking about the materiality of the ink. And, just the process of technology and ink as a technology. I think that's something that we often overlook is that, running water is a technology, and a ballpoint pen is a technology in the same way that electricity is a technology. So it seems like a very fleeting moment, but language is a technology, the way that language develops. So redefining our relationship with technology. These are some examples of William Anastasi's subway drawings. So he's sitting on a subway and with a pen, and as the subway is moving, the pen is making marks on the paper. So it's almost like the subway is making the work in collaboration with William. And then also these rusted steel plates, just kind of the entropy or the degradation of this cast steel. This informed the work in such a way where I'm thinking about collecting materials from the Philadelphia, the urban landscape. Still working with the landscape, but now I'm in the dense center city of Philadelphia. And, it's no longer the redwood forest. It's the crumbling car parts and the bricks and the, rats carrying the pizza in the subway and all that kind of stuff. So reinforcing this relationship of technology and thinking about perhaps the loss of ego and the loss of subjectivity. So I started working with these different robots and, the mechanized industrial aspect of the city in relation to architecture. So these are sheets of vellum that I've taken and I would set up a corral, and this little robot has a sensor on its nose. So as it gets close to the edge of the corral, it's like, uh-oh, and then turns around and moves to a different location. And so I was allowing the robot to make the work by attaching pencils or pens or lithographic crayon to the back of the robot. And, synthesizing those marks with the entropy or the detritus of these found pieces of steel and working with a salt water and vinegar solution. So speeding up this degradation process that would happen normally in an environment. So that's something that is really interesting to me as far as printmaking is It's essentially a speeding up of geologic time. So what would normally happen as far as an erosion process on an etched plate over a long period of time, if we're working with acids and etching into a copper or a zinc plate, it's happening very quickly. So we're encouraging an erosion or speeding up time in order to work and hack into this geologic process. So thinking conceptually about materials and also working with this ancient medium of encaustic and the robots, combining them in the same space. So like attaching sharp implements to the robots and having them scrape across this ancient medium, the encaustic wax. And, you know, I was layering these really thin, transparent colors of the encaustic and then letting the robots kind of scrape in. Also scraping into wooden plates and then printing on handmade papers. The physicality of these is quite dense in person. You know, there's a dimensionality to them. And thinking about, okay, there's this futuristic technology, robotic technology, but there are a lot of things that have come before that kind of get lost. They're like flowers into the void. So I started thinking about, okay, handmade paper and making large sheets of paper. This was my paper making setup towards the end of grad school. I constructed this kind of bath and screens, just window screens. And I was making these large sheets of paper. And when it came time for my thesis exhibition, it was sort of a distillation of all this into simplicity and a direct statement rather than having a bunch of work. I had, what was it, like 8 pieces total, but they worked together to make one statement. So I had this series of pieces on handmade paper, but the ink on this handmade paper was flocked. So it's, you know, using a dust and covering the ink so it has a really thick physicality. I decided to pulverize an obsidian glass, which if you think of obsidian glass as being in early human history, what would be made for knives or spears or for arrowheads, I view that as a very early technology that set us apart from the animal world. So, you know, these lines have this thick, rich, pulverized volcanic glass in it. And so as you would walk around, there'd be this kind of twinkle of the thick handmade ink on this handmade paper. And similar to how I was thinking about the space in the power plant, this space I was considering more as a frame for these works. So, you know, this book was really informative at the time. Tim Ingold, Lines. He goes into, you know, hereditary lines, lines of a map, artistic lines, sewing, all kinds of different aspects of lines from a liberal arts perspective. I think this is a great book for any artist or philosopher or liberal arts major to read. Tim Ingold, Lines. It's all about lines. And I started to think about how, you know, all these works, I wanted them to be unframed and floated from the wall. And the reason why that is because I was thinking a lot about how in the conventions of printmaking, there is this frame and the mat. However, you know, thinking about architecture and how, you know, regardless if there's a frame or not, work will always be framed by the architecture of the space in which it inhabits. So, you know, if there's a physical frame around the work, all fine and good, but regardless if that's true or not, our bodies, paintings, it's always going to be framed by the container in which it's inhabited. So you could view the wall as the frame or the entire three-dimensional space as the frame. And after finishing grad school, I got hired at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, which is a major collection of mostly impressionist and post-impressionist work. It's a pretty fantastic new space. You know, it's LEED Platinum certified. There's, you know, wood that's repurposed from the Coney Island Boardwalk. But there's this philosophy that really resonated with me. Just a little bit of history about the Barnes Foundation. It used to be a mansion in Lower Merion. Dr. Albert Barnes developed this medicine called Argerol, which was very helpful in the 19 teens and 20s in treating babies that had syphilitic infections from the mother. And it was a very successful treatment at the time. And he amassed this fortune from this medicine and bought tons of art throughout his entire life and filled his mansion with art. And he had some really early works that now have become famous. Like he has a Van Gogh's The Postman, there are a lot of Picasso paintings. And it's a really interesting example of a very eclectic collector who was obsessive about rearranging his collection. So right as I was finishing grad school, there was this controversy about his mansion was really dilapidated and didn't have temperature control or UV protection. And the city wanted to create a new space, but in his will, it said the paintings and objects can't move from their location in Marion. So there was this lawyer's dodge where they were able to say, well, what he actually says in his will is the paintings aren't allowed to be moved from their specific location. So what the city did is they built an exact replica of his mansion in Center City, Philadelphia, and then moved the paintings within, like a 16th of an inch in the same configuration as it was in the mansion to this new location. So I got hired as the new location opened up and began giving tours at this place, the Barnes Foundation. And the whole philosophy was there's a horticultural program that's attached to the Barnes Foundation. And in the old location, there was the mansion with gardens all around. But in Center City, Philadelphia, we had the gallery, and then there were gardens speckled throughout the interior space. So this is the Barnes Foundation inside. And, this experience, I worked there for 2 years before moving to Colorado, in addition to teaching as an adjunct professor. And the experience of working at the Barnes Foundation really solidified my belief in dissolving the hierarchy of craft, design, and high art. So in the Barnes, it's not uncommon to see like a French door hinge above a painting by Picasso. So there's like this very clear relationship. And Dr. Albert Barnes was thinking more about the aesthetic relationships of the works and was constantly circulating them, both through color, form, art as experience. And, I started to think about this dissolve a bit more critically and thinking about my experience in painting and printmaking, but now with a direct focus on materials. So I started making these handmade paper works. And they were a combination of, like horsehair and dyes and, recycled paper pieces. And I was thinking about this idea of containment and, the garden and the gallery, or the gallery and the garden, and the relationship of humans to animals and the materials around us in the natural world. So I decided to have these really organic material-based forms, but then have them scaled to the size of things like the IKEA bath rug or an IKEA towel, or things that seem very mechanized. So the scales are very deliberate of these pieces. And when I got to Colorado in 2014, I began preparing a solo exhibition for 2015, and this is the work that came out of that. So it was a combination of these deep material studies with encaustic and painting and handmade paper pieces. And the title ended up being A Vibrant Containment of Small Agencies. So thinking about how there are all these participants in our life, whether it's flowers, plants, animals, little bacteria, but it's all collaborating together and seemingly contained in the same space. This was a larger handmade paper piece from that show. And I was working with paintings and, crushing up rocks and putting them into paintings, thinking about where our pigments come from for painting and how can we make those more sustainable. Very textural, almost sculptural objects on the wall. I went so far as to actually work with some geologists and get crystals and different geodes and things that I was attaching into the work. There are about 5 or 6 of these kind of geode paintings where I'm, relating the actual chemicals and particulate to the pigments that I'm working with. And so these 2 books were very informative at the time. Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things by Jane Bennett, really talking about how matter can have agency and have, in a way, an effect on our world, and thinking about this idea of intraactivity as opposed to interactivity. So I think, in today, it's front and center, the idea of like the coronavirus. And, I haven't directly interacted with this deadly virus, nor do I have a family member who is infected, but intraactively, I am greatly affected by this. I'm having to give this presentation through a screen as opposed to being in person. So that's a clear example of how intraactivity, this seemingly innocuous small thing like the virus, can cripple an economy, or we're more interconnected than we are aware of. So these 2 books really deal with those issues on a very meaningful scale. And so I started to think about other ways I could hack into technological processes and apply them in a printmaking fine art context. So I started thinking about this specific jewelry making process called Electro Forming. And the idea is that you are taking an anode and a cathode, and you're dissolving copper and having it grow onto whatever you have coated with a, electrically charged paint is a good method. In my case, what I was thinking about was, could I potentially have 2 plates, one that's an anode and one that's a cathode, in the copper sulfate mixture? And rather than trying to make jewelry, could I have one of my plates being etched while the other plate was kind of growing? So there's this like symbiosis between the 2 plates. One is being etched while the other one is accumulating copper material. And this is a diagram of how that operates. So if you have a copper sulfate solution and there's an electrical charge between either copper or zinc, you can have selective areas be etched. The copper is being removed chemically, and then it's being deposited and growing on the other side. So this was kind of just a speculation. Okay, would this work? It works in the jewelry making process, but could I make plates that print well with this electroforming process? And I started doing tests working with copper, and they were working quite well. I was going to this specific site in Rocky Mountain National Park called the Alluvial Fan. It's like this kind of crumbling rock form. And, it seemed appropriate that I would be kind of dragging rocks across the surface to create a ground that would then be etched and electroformed. And so this is one of the pieces that's in the exhibition currently at Valley City State University. It was one of the first experiments working with this electroforming process and creating a plate that then is printed with a method called viscosity printing. So selectively adding ink and having the colors blend in certain areas. Here's a detail shot of the transfer of the ink from that electroformed plate onto the paper. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can kind of see the crustiness of the print. It's akin to like a lichen or a moss and I was very pleased with how these initial tests came out and the organic quality of the electroforming process on the plate, as opposed to like the precision of more traditional printmaking practices. So I started to think about, yes, the chemistry of that process, but then how could I potentially incorporate other agents such as animals or insects into the process? And these 2 books were very informative: Art and Agency by Alfred Gell, and then Animals in Translation by Temple Grandin. She's a veterinarian who teaches at Colorado State University and is a very strong advocate for autism in children as being not a hindrance, but actually a really powerful, way of thinking in the world. And then also, how can we have a better insight into how animals think? And perhaps they're far more intelligent than we give them credit for. And so I live in Colorado once again, and I raise chickens. So the first way I decided to approach this was to work with these dried mealworms and a molasses mixture, which is a really nutritious, good meal for chickens. And instead of me making the marks on the plate, similar to the robot, what if I was to entice the chickens by giving them this delicious meal on the plate, and then whenever they peck or scratch, that ends up being the resultant marks that then I could put through this electro forming process. So in a way, really removing my own ego or subjectivity away from the work, and just like a director perhaps preparing an apparatus for the actors to participate within, and then being comfortable with the result and it being a collaborative dialogue between the chickens, the plate, the processes, and myself. So this was the first piece to come out from that series. And I have these all labeled as Valis, and they have a title that's in conjunction with them. The Valis series, I selected about half of the prints from the Valis series to be in the exhibition at Valley City State University. And this is a major body of work that has continued on still. And the origin of the term Valis comes from a book by Philip K. Dick. It's called Valis, and it stands for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. So Philip K. Dick is best known for his novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the novel that was the basis for the film Blade Runner. There are other short stories that have been adapted into films. There's one called Minority Report, which is starring Tom Cruise. That's a film. So Philip K. Dick is a really influential science fiction writer for me. The Intergalactic Pot Builder is another good book by him. There's A Scanner Darkly, which was recently in the mid-2000s incorporated into an animated or rotoscopic animated motion picture. But this book, Valis, it describes this vast active living intelligence system, which essentially is a really ancient technology that is not controlling thought, but inciting change in the world constantly. And it's like this super computer intelligence that's far away in the galaxy and is able to kind of spark thought and is thought to have been like the generation of human consciousness. So kind of bizarre thoughts, but like really interesting and philosophical book. I highly recommend it. And it's a trilogy of books. It starts out with Valis and then continues on from there. So thinking about how potentially there are things outside of our realm of perception that are agents in, our conscious thought is one thing, but it can be a very arrogant way of viewing the world if like our conscious thought is the only thing that defines who we are. There's a lot of ourselves that is defined by our unconscious, and whether it's influences from society, our upbringing, things that are just embedded in us genetically. I'm a believer that our blood is not our own. There's a lot of predisposition through genetics, and that can trickle in psychologically. So these prints all deal with those issues, and thinking about aspects of how we can define our own existence, but also how we are part of a larger whole. So how are things like luxury or work defined for ourselves, but also within a larger context? So Until We Earn a Holiday is kind of my own personal narrative of like, do I deserve to have time off? Like, I should be working right now. No, you should be making more prints. So I think that's something that's ever present in my mind is like, am I doing enough? Like, am I a fool for being an artist? I think, should I be even teaching art? Like, what is the point? So everyone has that defined for themselves. And it's something well worth considering at every point in your artistic career is like, why am I making work? Is it important? I am a firm believer that all work is political. So regardless if you have a very poignant political stance, or if you are painting a pretty picture. You're not being a stockbroker, you're not being a lawyer, you're not being a politician, you're being an artist. And that's a very strong political stance, in my opinion. So, after all that kind of nebulous exploration and kind of spacey thought process, I wanted to be a bit more grounded in my practice. So I applied all of that kind of philosophic inquiry into a very specific project, which is the next body of work that I'm going to discuss. That's a continuation of the Valis series, but through a more direct narrative and pointed approach. So this is a view from Horsetooth Rock in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's a popular hiking destination. It's called Horsetooth Rock because it looks like a horse molar. And it overlooks Fort Collins. And so at night, there are all these really nice lights that you can see. It's wonderful during the day. It's like a high desert, so there's cacti and things like that, beautiful wildflowers in the spring. But at night, it's a wonderful place to see the stars and meteor showers. And I decided to apply all of this electro forming and viscosity printing methodologies to a very consistent series, and it's Auras of the Yellow Cake Power Beneath Our Feet. So I went up periodically to Horsetooth Rock and did sketches from observation of the nocturnal scene, and then was working with the chickens and other non-human agents to produce translations of my subjective sketches, these nocturnal sketches, onto the plate. And the idea is that all of these lights, where does that energy come from? I'm thinking about in the Colorado region and the New Mexico region, there's a lot of uranium mining. So by the yellow caked power, I'm thinking of like the yellow cake of uranium, and the palette is reminiscent of that. So there's the glow of this really kind of potent material, thinking of in relationship to pigments, but also like uranium is this heavy metal material that can power our lights, but also is very dangerous. And, this dichotomy of like, okay, there's this life-giving light, but also it can be used for nuclear weapons. So this entire series is on display at the McCarthy Gallery, and it's a synthesis of the Valis series in a very compact format. So the Valis series, those pieces are a bit larger, and this Auras of the Yellow Cake Power Beneath Our Feet, I wanted them to be very regimented, in a certain sense sterile and standardized, almost like a specimen of a scientific process. And there are 9 images in total. So, some of them started to branch off from direct observation and were sketches of aerial views, like I was on a plane and started sketching the Colorado River from the plane. Yes, from the Horsetooth Rock, but then also, from this really above view. And there's this kind of metaphor in film where if someone's looking from above, it's almost like a judgment, like, God's looking down on you from above. So I'm kind of thinking about judgments of how we've treated the world. Is this extraction of uranium really kind of detrimental, not only to our environment, but, native peoples, a lot of people on Navajo reservations have been poisoned by this extraction of uranium and things. Blue spruce grove with uranium pollen. Doesn't sound very great, right? I'm going to shift now into 2018 collaborative work that instead of working with chickens or robots, I was working with humans this time as participants in the work. And so I'm thinking about this idea of our impact on the natural environment. I had prepared these spruce tree cross sections from Colorado, and I imported them to Georgia for this project. I proposed to do this collaborative project for the SGCI conference at Georgia State University. And the project involved working with having the participants walk by and make 1 or 2 marks. And the more people that walked by, the more marks were made on these spruce tree cross sections. And throughout the day, I was printing them in relief. So, there was this collection of marks that was accumulating over time. And by the end of the day, there might be a lot of marks on some of these pieces of wood. And it's a very simple idea that, as more people walk by, we have a more impact on the environment, and people could take these home with them. So this was 2018, the first real participant-based collaborative project that I had done with human participants. And I proposed our project for 2019 at the Vermont Studio Center after this project developed, and I had thought about it a bit more, and thinking about, okay, well, there's our physical impact, but what about our mental impact, or things that are influencing the world based on our decisions? So that's where this major component to the McCarthy Gallery show came about. And the parallax errors from the polytemporal pluriverse, where that mouthful of words comes from, is a very specific scientific term. The parallax error is when you're looking at a measuring device, and if you look at it from the incorrect angle, there's a misperception of what the reading is. And that also occurs in space. It's like a color shift. So if there's a star and there's a little bit more of a blue or a little bit more of a red tint to it, it can be kind of a false impression of where the star is located in relation to time. So I'm thinking about, okay, what if instead of the parallax error not being a perception of space, what if it's a perception of time? So thinking about regrets from the past, or worries of the future. Those are errors, this idea of depression being a product of regret, or being caught up in things that you wish you had done, or anxiety being, thoughts of the future that haven't yet come to pass, but are kind of putting you in a sense of turmoil. So a parallax error in conjunction with time instead of space. So parallax error in the traditional sense is meant for space. I'm thinking about a parallax error in relation to time. So for the project, I decided to pick very specific materials, and I wanted to have this be a completely collaborative participant-based project where I was preparing a series of surveys for the participants. Once again, this was at the Vermont Studio Center, June 2019. And it was a perfect place to have people engaged with art participate in my project. And so I had these different materials and different scales of these materials. So there's wood, cloth, feather, and then I had VHS tape and cassette tape. And they all had very specific designations in the context of the surveys. So for instance, in one of these surveys, let's say, please select a wooden disc from the 9-disc spectrum based upon the following statement, with the smallest disc representing strongly disagree and the largest disc representing strongly agree. And the question is, I'm loved. So if you felt very loved, you might pick a large disc. If you felt unloved, you might pick a small disc. And then that disc would be inked up in a particular color for that day. So in this case, the color is yellow for that day. I would ink up the disc. And then the participant would place that disc on the printmaking press along an XY axis, depending on the next question. So in the case of this day, June 11th, 2019, please place the disc within the confines of the inner rectangle while considering the X and Y axis as a function of relationship quality towards your mother or father. So if you liked your mother more, go to the left. If you like your father more, go to the right. Preference for licorice, red going forward, black going back. So what I'm hoping to achieve with these is a full range of human experience, both, very deep, poignant questions, just ridiculous, silly questions, things that maybe don't have a yes or no answer. So the whole realm of human experience. And then the last aspect of this particular survey was, please select either a strip of VHS tape true or cassette tape false based upon the statement, my consumerist behavior in America directly funds wars abroad. So if you believe that statement, you'd put a VHS tape over the top of the disc. If you think that's false, you'd put a cassette tape over the top of the disc. And so this person believed that her consumerist behavior was funding wars abroad, so she selected the VHS tape. And then it was placed on the grid, run through the press, and printed on this grid of graph paper. So all of these symbols have direct relationships to the answers of the participants. And it's very encoded, right? You know, there's a lot in our world that's encoded with symbols, and this project exemplifies that fact to an nth degree. So all of the spacing and the relationship of these components have very specific relationships to these psychological answers that people were encouraged to evoke in their choices. Here are some more examples. I won't go through all of the surveys, but you know, here's one that is very simple but seemingly complex. You know, I believe in life after death. Yes or no? Who deserves more respect? This is the one that's a little bit more ambiguous. Firefighters or police officers? What's your aesthetic preference, a cactus or a pine tree? Mine's a pine tree, but you know, someone might be a cactus. So this went on for an entire week. You know, every day was a different color. And I ended up making a good number of these. And you know, when they're displayed together, I think they have more power than individually. So when I do display them, here's a slight shift working with the feather, a found feather, and the disc. And these little compartments or corrals, similar to the robot being corralled, I'm viewing it as like the human being corralled in their own psychology. So they're changing constantly. And this was kind of the rough installation view that I had in mind for an exhibition. And then, you know, in proposing for the McCarthy Gallery, I was looking forward to having them displayed a bit more formally. So I was very pleased when I got the acceptance and you know, was able to display these. Along with these graph paper pieces, I also was collecting data, which was essentially meaningless in the way that a lot of data collected online is meaningless, through something called the Parallax Scroll. So as people were making responses to the questions, every time there was some sort of human interaction, I had a dice that was coded to specific colors, and they had to roll the dice whenever they answered a question. And let's say they rolled a 5, that would be coordinated to, let's say, a teal. And then they would have to fill in their mark with the teal for that answer of that question. Let's say they rolled the dice and it was a 7, that corresponded to gray. So they had to fill in gray for that answer to that question. And so there's this collection of participants rolling the dice each time they're being asked a question, and it seems like this really complex like collection of data, but it essentially is meaningless. It's just someone rolling dice. So not that I'm absolute pessimist, but I am definitely cynical, and I think there's a lot of information that's gathered about us that if, let's say, some extraterrestrial civilization was to find it, it's like, wow, I don't really need to know this person's preference for toilet paper, or you know, yeah. So there's a lot of data that's collected about us that is used maliciously, in my opinion. But then also there's just a lot of just wasted data. So this is a subversion of all the data collection that's happening every time you touch your phone. That's being recorded. So I'm now going to transition into the last project, which is something I'm working on currently. I was just awarded a fellowship through the School of Global Environmental Sustainability at Colorado State University, and I'm going to be documenting lichens around the Colorado Front Range region and Northern California. This is a specific lichen that's indigenous to Northern California. It's called Ramalina menziesi. It's a lace lichen. And there are also crustose lichens in the Colorado region, which I'll be documenting, but this was the first test of the project. And the idea is that I'm taking these lichen structures and I'm exposing them photolithographically and then printing a dialogue with the lichen. And the lichen in of itself is a very poetic metaphor for me. I view it as, it's a symbiotic organism. So a lichen is fungi, a cyanobacteria, and then algae all in the same space, and they're working together as a symbiosis. And I'm thinking about how potentially there are aspects of our society that don't encourage those kind of symbioses and are somewhat exploitative. So, you think of more cynically, like larger corporations or things that are exploiting workers. And it seems very poignant now with everyone at home and like Amazon stock prices at all-time highs. And I think, the lichen is a very potent symbol of perhaps a better way of living, how we could be more in a symbiosis together and less of a predatory or parasitic relationship. So that's one of the reasons philosophically why I'm working in collaboration with the lichen, but also they're harbingers of climate change. So, the lichens and things that grow in this region in northern Colorado, in the Front Range region, are very sensitive to particular pollutants, but also can give indications of drought or a loss of water. It's a very arid region, but at the same time, water is valuable. So these root systems I also will be documenting as part of the project, which are these deep prairie grass root systems that search for water. So depending on where the water is, these roots will grow. And I'm viewing them as architectures, and the architect is water. The architect is water, thinking about how these root systems grow as the architecture, but who is designing that? The water is the one. So the water is the one who's making these forms be the forms that we see. So once again, tying it back to the beginning of the talk, how is architecture in our lives, both philosophically, scientifically, and in the natural world present, and how can we recontextualize or think about these architectures as collaborators and not necessarily from a specifically human or anthropocentric perspective, but there are things in the natural world that are examples of how we potentially could live. Thank you. Could open up for questions now if people have questions.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to students during all this time of COVID-19 we're dealing with? What advice would you give to students to do?
Well, so I'll kind of evoke Neil Gaiman, who I witnessed a talk. It was 2012 at the University of Arts. He was the commencement speaker. He's most well known for a graphic novel called The Sandman, but then also there's a children's animation called Coraline, and most recently there's a book of his that was adapted into a series called American Gods. Really interesting short story writer, graphic novel writer, and novel writer. And he essentially in his talk said something along the lines of, and I'm going to be paraphrasing now, he said, make art in the good times, make art in the bad times. The most important thing is to make art. So, it's very easy when everything's great. Maybe you have a steady income, you're eating like sandwiches with extra toppings and, to be making art. But sometimes the best art comes out of the bad times. So regardless if it's a good time, if it's a bad time, continue making work. That's really the most important thing is, and it's easier said than done. I think it's very easy to get paralyzed if you have a sick loved one or you're sick yourself, of course. But having a consistent work ethic and the ambition to follow through on projects and continue to work despite what complications arise is the most important thing for any artistic practice. And, I think there's this, in a way, kind of 20th century mentality that all of the work has to fit into a very nice, neat, tight package, and you have to have a style. Some consistency is important, in my opinion, but also it's somewhat disingenuous to 21st century thought processes and the interconnectivity of the World Wide Web and social media. So I think it's important to have a multi-dimensional practice. And by that, I don't mean like you need to do sculpture, and you need to do painting, and you need to do drawing, and you need to do clay stuff, and jewelry. I mean, a multidimensional practice in the sense that if you're thinking about the same thing or the same concept the entire time, that to me is the same as if you're having a conversation with someone over lunch and all they can talk about the entire time is global warming. It's like, I would hope that the conversation might deviate in different directions. Maybe you're talking about impoverished communities. Maybe you're talking about your nephew who did a cute thing the other day. So I think a multidimensional art practice is really important. Sometimes I make work just about how much I like pasta. Sometimes I make work about really deep philosophical issues that are pertinent now, have been pertinent in the past, and will be pertinent in the future, just basic things of human existence. Sometimes I'll attack a very particular art historical reference, like maybe there's this Marcel Duchamp piece that I really don't agree with, and I'm gonna make work that's kind of the antithesis of that. I think having a wide range and being open to just like silly work that I'm gonna dump paint and push it around like it's mud, and then also having really serious inquiry, all of that together, and then picking and choosing what seems to fit and being able to write and reflect about that. I think too often we are encouraged to have like a really deliberate plan from the get-go, and there's less emphasis put on the analysis after the fact. And that's really important, is to analyze work after you make it. You might not know why you're making it in the moment, but then having the patience to really analyze the work that you have made. So if you could have all those things, regardless in the good times, the bad times, a multidimensional practice where you're not afraid to just make something that seems dumb, but then also, really researching why you did something after the fact. I think that's really important.
So just checking the chat. Anybody have questions or? Oh, here I have one. When you use found materials and debris in your work, what is the point between something that is visual, creatively important, and garbage? Can you describe your inner dialogue?
So like, if I had something in my studio and the janitor came to clean, and would they throw it away or not? Sounds like the question. So there's a whole art movement, called Art Povera. It's a school of Italian artists, and they're working essentially with trash. And I think there's also a book that I'd recommend to whoever asked this question. There's Nicholas Bloriard. It's called The X Form, and it talks about how there's artistic creation and making something new, but also our disposal habits or our loss can also be a really interesting aspect of like the empty space. Let's say the pieces that I was working on where I was drilling the holes and I was going to print the discs, but then the thing that was going to be discarded ended up being the work. That's a clear example of where perhaps the discarded thing, which technically was trash, can be elevated and recontextualized. So back to the Art Povera artists, there's one artist in particular, Michelangelo Pia Stiletto, and his most famous work, it's called the Venus of the Rags. There's this Venus sculpture and then all these dirty old rags next to it. And there's various layers to that work. But I had the pleasure in 2011 of hearing him talk, and he did this collaborative project in Philadelphia with underprivileged youths where he had this giant ball of tape, and the project was just having students with gloves push this giant ball of tape along the Schuylkill River, and then any trash that was collected along the path of the river by this giant ball of tape ended up being the work, and then it was put in the museum. So the work doesn't necessarily have to be about the object. It can be about the process or the act of itself. So to me, okay, the work is not actually the ball of trash that was collected by these children pushing the ball. It was the act of these children pushing the ball and it being a metaphor for perhaps their life or their impoverished condition and all of that. So I think, when we're working with things that are seemingly discarded, there's an aspect to that where it can be more interesting to think about not the object itself, but like what are the origins of those materials, or why is that considered trash? So yeah, long story short, for me also the collection process is both in reading and also like materials is the process or is the art too. So like when I was in Philadelphia collecting materials, it would be these long walks in the city, like picking up maybe a little bolt or something and like wondering like where was this bolt made, or like where did it come from, like what conversations surrounded this bolt, did it fall off of someone's car, whatever. So I think the idea that I want to drive home is that there are the objects, but then also those carry so much meaning. Like where does the bolt come from? Who has touched that bolt? And that to me is the art.
Interesting. Anybody else have questions? Want to send in on chat or? So you said you had another big fellowship. What's your next show you're hoping to do after that?
So I've been working with this process, and one of the pieces that I have at the McCarthy Gallery, it's a large handmade paper piece, and it employs a process called cyanotype. So cyanotype is essentially a blueprinting process. So you're working with a light-sensitive liquid, and then anything that's exposed to UV light turns this kind of dark bluish color, and anything that is blocked out from UV light remains white. So because there's this tie of that medium to architecture, when I'm working with the lichens for this next project, I'll be working a lot with cyanotype and thinking about the architecture of the lichens in that way. And that'll be on handmade papers, and there'll probably be about 100 of these cyanotype pieces, and that'll be displayed in Fort Collins in spring 2021. But first I need to go around and document all these lichens and have the field research part of the project be realized once I'm allowed to leave my house. Yeah.
That's the hardest part right now as artists. We're kind of stuck in one spot.
Yeah, I have this other project that works with appropriated imagery. So I'm like scanning in old etchings and mashing them up, and using a program called GIMP. It's like a free open source equivalent to Photoshop. And I'm, like making these digital collages, and I'm, looking forward to working with photolithography or using a laser engraver to engrave on wood. So it's like, I feel like I have a lot of prep work that I'm able to do here, but I'm not even allowed to go into the print studio, which is, kind of sad. I have things I can do here because I have a small studio in my garage, but it's not the same as having access to the full print studio. So I can definitely empathize with my students in that regard. And, I have put forth significant effort into restructuring the curriculum for the rest of the semester so that, they are able to do work at home with non-toxic processes. So that's made me think a bit more about how I might structure an entire non-toxic K through 12 printing class. So that's been kind of fruitful. And that's something that I always consider is like, what impact do we have on the environment with all the solvents or things that we're doing in printmaking, and just being conscious of that and trying to keep things as non-toxic as possible. So I consider that research as well. Yes, maybe you're not actually producing a painting or a print, but that's like fodder that can reap dividends later on, once you are able to be free from the corral.
And would there be any other books would you recommend to the students to read just for?
Ooh, yeah. There are some on the screen right now that I think are really applicable. Maybe not the first two; those are a bit more specific. But Slow Art is a great one by Arden Reed. It's Slow Art: The Experience of Looking, Sacred Images to James Turrell. He goes through like really old illuminated manuscripts all the way up to these really kind of spiritual James Turrell pieces, and how it's kind of like there's this loss of slow looking through digital culture. And so, yeah, it's really well written. So I highly recommend that. And then, The Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulacine by Donna J. Harway. Those two out of the group here that I have on the screen are the ones that I would recommend that students look into. The Staying with the Trouble book really encapsulates a lot of the things that I was talking about in my artist talk, relating humans and non-humans in the same space, and how we could think more consciously about perhaps examples in the natural world that are applicable to the way that we could structure society or recontextualize or think about more humane ways of being human, let's say.
Which is important.
Yeah, I would agree.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Johnny while he's on?
And if you don't think of any now, you can always email me if you have questions, or if you're like, what was the name of that book? I can't remember. I'm happy to, stay in contact. So, sure. And also you have my work hostage. So,
Yeah, that's good.
I'll be back there at some point.
Johnny, this is Al Lefebvre. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to share this incredible presentation with all of our students and faculty here at VCSU. We really appreciate it very much, and I found it to be very fascinating. So thank you for your time.
Oh, you're welcome, of course. Yeah. This is the fun stuff. Designing an online curriculum within a week is not fun, but this is fun.
Right. Right. Well, best wishes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lefebvre. And anybody else have any questions before we sign off? Doesn't look like it, but I will definitely take any emails and I can send those to Johnny. And Johnny, again, thank you very, very much for joining us this afternoon. I know you have meetings and we all have the fun of the COVID-19 quarantine.
Well, thank you for the opportunity for the show. And, I look forward to potentially doing a paper making thing for you all online. So let me know about that. I'd be happy to, if it's a nice day outside, bring my computer outside and teach people some recycled paper making stuff. So
definitely, it's a good way. It's Earth Month anyway for April.
Yeah, that's right.
So again, thank you, and we will be in contact, especially for getting your artwork too out of McCarthy.
Oh yeah, I don't have concerns about it.
No,
but just let me know, and then I'll plan. If it ends up being like the end of May or June, that's fine. Also I don't want to take up space if you have something planned, so just let me know.
I will, definitely.
Yeah.
So again, thank you everybody, and have a great afternoon. And I know, so yes.
Yeah, thank you. Take care, everyone. It was good.